Hi, thank you for joining us for our second webinar. This one's on single point radius bandsaw techniques. So this whole idea of doing webinars has come about because Brian has been, although he's taught all over the world, we get emails and phone calls almost weekly asking if Brian is teaching. And it's one of the things that he's been really committed to, and that's keeping the craft alive. So we had to find another way to allow him to be in front of an audience where he can share some of the techniques and things that he's learned over the years. And doing that, being away from the shop for a week or two, just isn't feasible with the demands of what's going on here every day. And to have people come into the shop would just shut down production. So we're hoping that these webinars are going to create a virtual classroom that will allow a broader audience to have access to what he's teaching at a much lower price point as well. So today what we're going to move into are three areas. One is the circle jig, cutting with a circle jig, then the fence and sled, and then freehand bandsawing. We're thinking that if you've got burning questions that you can't wait, we'll answer some of those right after each technique. And then we'll have a larger Q&A at the end. I do want to say that this second one is a huge improvement. Well, we hope it'll be a huge improvement on what our first one was. And a large part of that is due to you guys giving us feedback. We had quite a few of us recommend different things. And so we've upgraded our platform. We've got different lighting. We've made some other investments. We made Brian take a day off of woodworking and spend a day in preparation and trial. And so we hope you enjoy this one, but let's go ahead and get started.
Is that, just got mic'd up. Is that working? Can you tell? You can hear it? Okay. So welcome to the second webinar. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to first start talking about how I think about freehand sawing a circle. And one of the things I did, this was about 3 or 4 years ago, is I did an exercise to try to understand what my hands are doing while sawing an S-curve. I just rigged up a couple of pencils that were drawing a line on a piece of plywood as I mimicked the action of going through the saw, cutting an S-curve. And I was really surprised and actually horrified at how inconsistent the part was in its path through the saw. And so I've used that to kind of motivate me to set up better processes and some jigs and fixtures for really perfecting cutting. But it also helped me understand what my hands are doing and what my mind is doing while I'm cutting anything on the bandsaw. What is the pattern when most people, and including me, are doing at the bandsaw and trying to follow a line, is you're standing here and you're thinking about the line you're cutting, and your hands are just doing what your body thinks they should do. But the tendency is not to think about the path your hands are taking, or if it's a circle, where the center of the circle is. If I'm cutting this circle perfectly, this hole in the center doesn't move at all. But if you just rub up against a blade like this sometime with a well-cut circle and see how well you're able to keep that hole from moving anywhere. Ultimately, that's the pivot point. That's the still point. So I'm going to turn this saw off and try to cut this, and watch the line I'm cutting, and also watch this and watch my hands. Ultimately, my hands should be going around in a circle just like any other part of the circle is. I'm just going to be ultimately going in a perfect circle. Well, I'm doing a bad job of sawing that because I'm trying to stay out of the way of the camera. I'm usually right in front of it. but I'm more or less holding the line. And of course, what I would do in real life, in production, if I were going to saw freehand, I would leave a little bit and I would expect to go back and sand that to the line just as well as, as carefully as I could. But if this were a perfect circle, I would be able to take this cutoff and match it up anywhere on here. And you can see it doesn't, let me just get that out of the way. So it should be a perfect match along here. And it's not terrible, but there are little gaps in there. So if I were wanting to glue veneer on here on this edge, it would be very difficult to get a good glue bond there. And sanding, I can chase that in a little bit better. But if I were making, say, a Lazy Susan or a small table like this, it would be difficult to go from here and true that edge up, except possibly with a router. And what I want to do is today to show you bandsaw techniques that will leave an absolutely perfect glue-ready surface on the edge of any circle. So the first process I want to talk to you about is using a circle cutting jig. Now this is a jig I made just recently, actually for this. I had a different one that's really not very good for teaching about. So this is a rib that in the case of your bandsaw jig, you would make it slide into a T-slot on your bandsaw. I don't have a T-slot, so I designed this to go onto a piece of aluminum extrusion that I bolted to the side of the table. But yours would go in here and it would just be made to fit your T-slot. And the reason you have that is so you're going to have to slide into the cut, and then this piece here hits the table and stops. And where it stops exactly is very important. This slot here is, that's the wrong one. Uh-oh. Anyway, this slot here is perpendicular to the drift or cutting direction of the saw. And when you set this up, you want to check that this is dead perpendicular or on a line dead perpendicular to this. And Melanie, can you come over here and get a look at this? What I want is for the pivot point of this jig, I want you to show them where this square is hitting that blade.
Sorry, guys.
So the pivot point is on a line square to the drift that intersects the blade just behind the gullet. And I'll show you as we're cutting why that's true. But for those of you who saw the first seminar or webinar that I did, I was talking about the importance of always cutting exactly in line with the blade. Well, when you're cutting a circle through here, you're cutting an arc, but you want to enter the teeth of the blade with the force directed exactly in line with the blade. And that's why in a straight line you would always have it in line with the band, is so that the force pushing back doesn't cause the blade to deflect and also doesn't cause it to pull in one direction or the other. So you want this to be exactly perpendicular, and you want it to be on a line exactly just behind, just right behind the gullet there. This is adjustable. It's a nut. I'll explain this a little bit later, but it's and we'll have plans for these available on the website that'll show exactly how to make these. But this is just a V groove here, and this is two pieces of wood that are sandwiched against each other with a nut there. So I'm going to cut a piece of. Here it is. So this is what I loosen that, and it allows me to move this anywhere. What I'm going to do right now as a demonstration is I'm going to cut an 11.5-inch circle, or 11.5-inch radius circle. So I'm measuring from this side of the blade to the center of this pivot point. This is a standard Allen screw, but I had to adjust it by grinding it down so it would fit easily into a 1/2-inch hole. I just chucked it up on the lathe. You can chuck it up on a in a drill and file it, or in a drill press and file it or sand it down so that it fits into a 1/2-inch hole and allows the part to turn freely without any resistance. Now, when you make your jig, you want to sand and wax these guides here, or your guide, into the T-slot so it's easily pushed forward and you're not feeling much resistance there, so that you can feel the cut. So I'm pulling out here and I'll drop this right on the pin there. Well, we've got chips in there. Turn over the other way. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to turn the saw on. You want to enter the saw slowly. And just as a test, look here and see that the blade is exactly parallel to the cut you're making. That's telling you that your jig is moving in line with the drift, and it should stay parallel as you rotate. You want to maintain just light pressure in that direction against the pin, and you want even speed, and you don't want to stop at any point. Now, that's not cutting anymore because it's out of the circle. Looks like I could sand that pin just a little bit more. So you can tell if it's a true circle if you can rotate this around and not have any variation in the gap of the cut. And that's you can see that's just pretty perfect all the way around there. So that surface quality is good enough to glue a veneer right on. If you're wanting to get a really good glue joint quality cut, you're going to need to use a smooth cutting blade. And what I've got on the saw right now is a 1/2-inch skip tooth, 4-skip blade. That's the smoothest cutting of the carbon blades that I know of. It's the blade that we use on this saw all the time, whether we're doing straight cuts or we're doing curved cuts. This blade will cut a radius of about 4 inches or so. Sometimes it'll go a little bit, if it's fresh, it'll go a little bit tighter radius than that. But if I'm going to cut a tighter radius than 4 inches, I'm going to want to put a smaller blade on that. So that's simple circle cutting. And of course, you can cut whatever circle you want on here. And you can, make your jig so that it's not so big that it's hard to store it, but big enough to cut just about all of the circles you want. And what I've done is I've added an extension to this that allows me to cut. I can cut just about I can cut an 8-inch diameter table if I want to. This extension is hung in here, but the extension would add on just like this. It just slides in and then gives me a second slot way out here. And that I had that on the other day and it worked really well. So that's an option if you want to get wider circles. You can either add an extension or just make a bigger jig that gives you bigger options. So I'm going to put that back on and talk about another process I use for cutting circles and arcs. But before I do that, why don't we stop and ask, see if anybody has any questions they want answered about this particular process.
Okay. From the internet, we have a question. One of the fellows, Tom, asked if you could drill the pilot center hole just part way through, leaving solid material on the top.
Absolutely. The question is, can you drill the pilot hole only part way through? And you certainly can. It's a little trickier to find it. Another option that you can do, once you've cut a disc like this, you can drop it back on there and use it essentially as a lazy Susan. And you can double stick tape whatever you're cutting a circle onto this. The problem with the blind hole is that it's very hard to get it set on here very well. So using this as a lazy Susan, like if I wanted to make a larger table and didn't want a hole in it, I would back this up and make whatever size I wanted, but just using this double stick tape to my actual part.
Do we have any questions from the audience? All right, let's.
Okay, we're good to go. So the next method I use for cutting, this is what I would use for cutting full circles, or I would use this method for making other jigs. So what I did the other day is I set up to make all of these jigs out of a piece of MDF, and I made a series of about 8 circles or arcs, and these I can use as fences, or either one as a fence. So I made these, I used this system to cut these arcs, and then what I did is I would put a veneer on the edge and chamfer it. The veneer is the thickness of the saw kerf. So whenever you take a kerf out, you need to fill it so that mates perfectly. It looked on that other part like the pieces fit really well, but they're not a perfect fit unless you fill the lost kerf with a veneer. So that's glued on there and trimmed and sanded smooth. And then for good wear resistance on this edge, this has been soaked with super glue and then sanded smooth and waxed. So this slides through there easily, so that what I'm feeling as I'm sliding this through a cut is I'm just feeling what the saw blade is doing. I'm not feeling resistance from this. So I want to demonstrate with one of these that I have set up. I'll pull this guy off. So what I've done on this one is I've cut a slot in here for the band blade. And when I cut all of these, I cut them in the part so that the center of rotation, or that pin that was on the other jig, the circle cutting jig, was right in line with where I want this to swing through. Remember, we want to swing, even though we're using a fence now instead of a circle cutting jig, we still have to be in line with the blade, so that when I'm cutting through here, no matter what width I'm cutting here, this fence if I butt it against the blade, should be dead parallel to the blade. So you can see that there. Right here, you can push this up and check to see if this is parallel to the blade. And so this can be adjusted a little bit this way to get that set up. But the way I made this is that this line here is the line that that pin is on. So as long as this is perpendicular to the cut, then it should be set up correctly. So you can clamp this at both ends. Right now, I've just got a block here that's a stop to get my orientation this way, so that it's, when I slide it back and forth, it's always in the same position. And I'm going to back it up with the fence. You can use whatever fence you've got that goes with your saw, can be used like this. So let's see. And I want my fence parallel. So with this, with the fence parallel to the table, this is going to be perpendicular to the cut line. And that's what I need. So I'll explain what this spacer is about in just a little bit. What I've done after that is I've just made a little fence that's screwed down to here, and it can be set in different positions.
Let me get up close on that, so we can see.
And this is just a little maple 2x2 that I've got double stick taped to this fence. So I'm going to cut a little slat out of here that is about 3/4 of an inch thick. So what I'm going to do is set this here, make my cut, remove this, let that slide over, and that movement over is the thickness of the part minus a kerf, because I'm trading sides. So I'm cutting on this side. The second cut is going to be on this side. So I need to move over. I need to move this over whatever thickness I want, plus the thickness of a kerf, which I know in this case is 40 thousandths of an inch. So let's just do that. So I'm going to start in this position, because this is, if I do the other cut first, my part falls off and I don't have a chance to use the fence again. So make sure this is snugged up here. And I'll turn on the saw. Again, take a smooth, even feed rate. If you look at that kerf going past the blade, it's nice and parallel to the blade. Take the spacer out, push it over. And so that gives me a really nice uniform. Could be a chair slat, a rail. It could be a drawer front if you for a curved dresser. This is a method I use for all kinds of parts making, including making bending forms for either lamination or steam bending. It just gives you a very consistent, very repeatable curve. You can do a similar thing with the other jig that I just showed you. You would have this part could be swung from the pin, but it's a little trickier to get the second cut using that and get it really consistent. There are ways to do that. So there's another way to get a second, your second cut oriented. If for whatever reason this process wasn't going to work for how you're setting up, what we could do is have a second position of the fence. You see I've got screws holding this down here. Can you see that? There's 2 screws here. Well, let me tip it up this way. You can see one here and one here. Can you back up, Melanie, so you can get, yeah, there we go. They're the 2 screws. And you see I've got a shaped opening here. What that allows me to do is, well, this would be the second position actually. But I could have, this would be one position. Put it in that hole. And then this would be the second position. So you could have a fence that works like this. This was just a quick setup. I've got a lot of different ways that I use this kind of jig. And a lot of times we'll just be cutting one side of a piece in a jig like this. And you can also have, like in this case, I'm making a I get convex and concave mixed up all the time. I'm making a convex curve on the part. If I wanted to make a concave cut, my part would need to be on the other half of the jig. So that would mean that this part would be stationary. So I could set this up here. And I would have to cut a slot into that, which I'll go ahead and do. So this is the line that is the ray. Now on this line, way back here somewhere, it is the pin that this swung from in the jig, in the radius jig that I had. So I'm going to make a cutout here where the saw blade will inset. The saw blade has to be inset into a curved fence. You can't have the blade out there, otherwise you're going to cut your sled. So you've got to hide it up in that. Actually, I'm going to mark this on the other side and make it easier to cut. So you can set it here, clamp it down like we did the other one. Now on this one, the fence isn't going to work. It's arched on both sides. What I did is I just had a sequence of these, and it was male on one side, female on the other, and so it gave me a lot of different fence options from a single jig. So. But I would do the same thing. I could set up here, and if I wanted to do just one single cut, I could have marks here, I could have a fence here, and then go through and make my cut that way. I'll show you an example of a jig that we've been using lately. Melanie, if you can pan over onto the Suniva rocker. In this chair, I wanted to address the fact that I wanted this joint here to be perpendicular to the rail, yet my legs splay front and back. So I wanted the face of this to be relatively perpendicular to this. And an elegant way to do that was to create a curve, but that would have made a really fat foot. So I made a second curve back the other way. And then we came in here. This is an example of one of these legs, and now in the jig that we used to cut it with. But we've got a fully housed double tenon here, and of course, again here. But with this jig, clamping it in here, and then I've got 2 radius cuts using that same jig, the first jig, or I could use one of these to create 2 radius cuts that give me the shape of this part. And then with this clamped down, we could run this through here to get these cuts exactly. Now, this actual jig is about 7 years old, and it's seen a lot of wear and tear. But so we've had to keep reshaping this as we have incidents and bandsaw cuts on here. That's why it's so why it hangs over so much. And if you have a system like this and you're doing a lot of reproduction of an exact part, then what you would probably want is not a curved fence, both front and back. You'd have a fence like this one. So this one, also a very old jig. And because we've had to repair this so much, we've got about a 9/16 overhang here. So we would set this jig 9/16 of an inch, and we're set to go. We put the fence back up, clamp this here to the fence. And then clamp it down. Since this is already cut, I'm not going to run this through there. But just without that, you can see how this is going to follow right through there. Once that's all the way cut off, set it here and make that cut. So it's pretty quick, very accurate, and it allows us to make these cuts over and over again with really, really good consistency. And that's really important on this design because there's a joint here. And so this distance needs to be the same. That curve needs to be the same because we're setting up on another jig that references the back of this part. And we need to have this depth just right so the chair comes together right. So there's some other processes I use with this. I thought we'd so I wanted to stop here and
It's actually the fence, isn't it? The fence and sled.
that was the fence and sled.
That's what I'm saying.
So it's left a good bit of time for questions. If anybody has questions.
I can't look over there. She's doing something else.
Law?
Questions.
One question. I think that it's actually going back to the first section.
Okay.
Ron asked, what about insetting a smaller circle in the jig that could be taped to your piece to avoid a hole?
Well, okay, so the question is, with regard to the first piece, let me set this back up here. I'm not going to engage it. I'm just going to set it up here. The question was, can you just have a smaller circle that sits here? Yes, you can. And that's what I was, so that you didn't have to have a hole in your actual part. And that's what I was talking about, using this as essentially as a lazy Susan, so that this would be spinning and your part. So I could double stick tape this plywood to this and spin this through the saw like that and have no hole in this part at all. So yes, you can, and you can have this be whatever size was appropriate for what you're wanting to do. If I had, say if I was this far from the blade and I had a big table up here that I was wanting to cut, I would certainly want to make sure there's plenty of double stick tape on this, but I would also want to have support out there. So I've got to, I would have another piece of MDF on that side of the saw, well, 1.5 inch thickness essentially on that side of the saw, supporting the overhang. You don't want to cantilever too much, or you'll have a problem at the saw cut. Did that answer your question? I guess.
So another question, which I think is actually about the fence and sled.
Okay.
Does each radius need to? Oh wait, we're going to go back just for a quick moment on this one. Can you inset a circle of say like 4 inches? Is what he says, like a tiny circle.
Into the fence and sled?
No, into the circle jig.
Can we use a 4-inch circle in here?
Yeah.
Whatever size circle you want to be cutting, you can cut with this. Now, your limitation is how close you want to get with your stop point.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really, in this case, that I stopped here because we just don't have any arcs that we make smaller than that, or rarely do. So you can, there's no limit as to how small you can make this, except the limit of your saw's ability to, whatever your blade's ability to cut a radius, that's your limitation, not the jig.
If you had though a 4-inch piece.
Right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just using this one that I just cut as a talking point.
Yeah.
But there's no, you don't have your jig yet, so you can make your jig according to the size circles you want to make. But it's adjustable, so you can make it adjust all the way up.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to go back to the fence and stud. And Kent asks, each radius to be cut needs a set of fences.
The question is, each radius that needs to be cut needs its own set of fences. If you have a one-off radius, you don't need to build fences. You can use this jig to do that with. The reason that I use a fence and sled system is for making parts like I showed you with that chair leg. We've got another product here, this stool, which has a lot of these curves in it. There's this one here and this one here that are pretty much just like they're different curves, but they're pretty much just like the outdoor chairs that I showed you. We also have this scoop cut out here on the foot bar. That's it's actually the same radius, but it's a different jig that cuts that. And then the seats and these swoops are also different cuts that are done on a fence and sled. So where you're wanting to just cut one radius, this jig is really good for that. The fence and sled methods are really more for repeated production items. And so you could make whatever fence you want using this. So this is the jig that I would recommend first, because this is the one that makes your fence and sleds, and it makes them very quickly and easily. In fact, maybe I'll just do that here in a minute. We've got a little bit of time. Let's see how many questions we have first. but I can go ahead and demonstrate how to make a fencing sled.
So, going back to Ron with his small circle,
Mm-hmm.
He says basically what he's wanting to do is enlarge the 1/2 inch hole to be inside an inset circle, so you don't need a plate the size of your circle that you're cutting.
He wants to set a smaller circle
Mm-hmm. That's what it looks like.
inside.
An inset circle is what it. But enlarge the 1/2 inch hole to be inside an inset circle is what he says. So you don't need a plate the size of your circle.
You don't need you do need a plate that's going to support whatever circle you're cutting well enough. And you can do that. I mean, we can have a small circle here if that's what you want, but you want enough area. If you're attaching it with double stick tape, you've got to have enough area to hold that, for the tape to hold it still. Otherwise, you could use what I've done on a lot of jigs is just run screws through so their points barely stick up, and then you would have tiny points of holes in your part, but you could press that on and tap it on and then set it on here and spin it through. But actually I would set it on here and then press it and tap it on. So I'm still not sure that I'm answering the question the way you meant. Is there another question there, and he can clarify if he needs to come back with that?
No, I think we're set. We'll clarify later.
Okay, we'll clarify that one later. So since we've got time, I'm going to go ahead and actually make a sled. So with this, what I'd like to do is make a sled that's about over here somewhere. And so my hole is going to be here. And this is just an example of how to cut these. Another thing that you can do, let's say I'll put a hole here so that it'll be about a 17, 18 inch radius. If I wanted a larger radius, what I would do is move this out to whatever radius I wanted. And my sleds aren't that big. If I wanted to make a sled that's this big, this is a 40-inch radius. If I had a 40-inch radius that I needed to make on a sled and my part is only 10 inches wide, I can't reach the pin. So what am I going to do? For that, there's a lot of different things you can do, but you need to make some kind of extension. So you can have something, a board here that has your hole in it and attach it to that. I should probably do that. I wasn't planning on doing that, but except I don't have a board here. Let's just cut this the way I was going to. So I need to drill a 1/2 inch hole. Right here. Make sure that's centered. That didn't help. So I'm going to ream this hole out just a little bit so it spins more easily. Okay, so let's make say about a 20, now let's make an 18-inch sled. So I've got to set this into the saw track. And there it's stopped. And I'll move my pin to 18 inches. Can you see? I'm blocking the camera now. So my pin's at 18 inches. Now, when you're making sleds and things, actually you don't need the sliding feature of this because I've got plenty of room to swing into the cut with this. When you're cutting a circle, you're not swinging in like this. Your whole piece is out here, and you've got to be able to enter the cut this way. But since I'm starting outside the cut and just cutting into an arc like that, I can just leave this in its position, in its home position, and swing this right through. So now with the bigger sled like this, I've got a lot of room over here to set up whatever kind of fence feature I want to set up. But I would want to sand this, super glue it, sand it, and wax it again. And then I would put the veneer here to fill out that kerf space that we just took out. Now that really is optional. I always put a veneer in there because it's a good durable way to go. But you'll get a pretty darn accurate cut, accurate fence and sled relationship just going right with the saw cut. And you can just sand both sides, super glue them, sand them again, and wax them. That'll make a pretty good durable sled. And then with this centered, the way I've made this sled, this can just be against the fence, and I would make a centered recess for the blade. Just cut that out. What am I doing? Cut this out here so that your blade can fit into that. So let me get this out of the way. So with this centered, as long as I've got the blade in that pocket and I've checked to see that this is parallel to my saw, then that's going to be set so that the radius point is perpendicular to the blade like it's supposed to be. And then I can orient whatever I want to cut on this to cut right through there. I want to show this as an example of a fence on a sled. Now this is for an S curve, but it doesn't matter. What I want to show you is one way of getting a repeat two position adjustment for a sled or a fence. So this is where the workpiece would go, and on this one I just screw it to the fence, and I'm screwing through what's going to be waste anyway, and it's going to be cut off. So I just have to make sure that my screws don't stick out too far. So with this one, the fence just loosens here, and I can adjust it to the second position. Actually, that's the first position. And then once I've made the first cut, I adjust it to the second position. And depending on, what's the orientation of the second arc that you want to cut. Any questions about that?
Yes. Dan asks, he says, I see you don't clamp your jigs to the table. How do you avoid wobble?
Wobble of the fence, I suppose. Well, now the question is, how do I avoid wobble when I don't clamp my fences to the table? Is that right? Is that the right?
Clamp your jigs to the table.
I don't clamp my jigs to the bandsaw table. I do always have something securing them, but there is the possibility of wobble. So this one could wobble, I suppose, if it weren't flat and weren't laying on the bench of the thing flat. This stop keeps it from going forward. The fence keeps it from going backwards. But all I'm guiding with is this curve. So there's nothing really that should be making this wobble. And even if it did wobble, that curve really isn't going to change. If this corner dropped and this corner came up a touch, or vice versa, because this was warped, I don't think that's going to change anything. But we've been using, like, you can see how much use this guy has gotten. This is another one. I can tell by the name of that. We changed the name of that chair. Melanie, how long ago was that? 7 years ago?
Yeah, I think 2011, 2012. Yeah.
So it's been that long, and it's been kept in the shop, and it's laying still pretty flat. So that's just never been a problem for us. I don't think it's anything to worry about. As long as your table's flat, MDF tends to stay pretty flat as long as it stays nice and dry. I hope that answered your question. Is there another question?
Okay. When making jigs, are there any considerations to using MDF over plywood, or do you use whatever you have on hand?
The question is there any consideration of using MDF over plywood? Plywood is definitely a lot more durable, but I use MDF a lot just because it's a lot cheaper. It's not healthy to work with because the dust is toxic, but it's made out of wood dust, so it's a pretty, I think from that standpoint, probably fairly sustainable. But the main reason is just economy. Some of my jigs I make out of birch ply. I like birch ply because it is a much more durable product, but it's not always worth it. So that's the biggest thing. Actually, MDF will generally lay a little flatter than birch ply will. I mean, we use 15 ply, 3/4 inch birch for a lot of things, and it makes a nicer jig. But MDF has a lot of good uses in jigs, and in fact, I even use use it for jigs where I need to tap and thread into the MDF. What I'll do is I'll drill a hole, just as if I were tapping into metal, and then soak the hole with super glue, bore it out again, and then oil my my tap real well, and go ahead and tap that. Sometimes I'll hit it again with super glue, but it makes a very durable thread. Super glue soaked into MDF, it just makes a very hard material where you need specific strength and hardness in one little spot. You're not going to soak the whole thing in super glue. Is there another question?
What kind of breathing protection do you use, especially with the MDF?
Well, my saw doesn't need to breathe. What kind of breathing protection do I use with MDF? If either I've got good dust collection on whatever I'm working with, or I use just a dust mask. Probably not adequate, but we're not working with MDF very much. Even though we make a lot of jigs out of it, like I said, that jig's been in use for 7 years. So, and I just made some jigs yesterday, but you know, we've had 2 sheets of MDF in the rack now for 6 months, I think, and this is the first time I broke one out. So it's not like the shop is full of MDF dust.
What does the S-curve jig run against?
What does the S-curve jig run against?
And can you demonstrate?
And can I demonstrate it? It's 5 till 1.
It is. We have time.
Well, he might have to do stock prep.
I've got a piece. That's a can of worms to open up, but it's an interesting one, and Law says we do have time, so I'll go ahead and demonstrate that. It's not just an S-curve, it's an S-curve with a straight section, and it's cut at a compound angle. So you asked for it. Now, this saw is just such a treat to use, and whenever I set up jigs, and I can do it, I use these holes as locators, and I just have pins built into the jig like this. Melanie, can you get that in there? These 2 pins are set to drop into those holes, so I don't need to clamp this up. One of the things that's really important when you're making a jig for anything is that it doesn't take long to set it up. I do not like tapping on my saw. This is a huge hunk of cast iron, but when I'm trying to maintain good square blade orientation, I need to check after tapping. There we go. Yeah, that's maybe even on the other side of the saw. Okay, then over there would probably do it. I'm going to be going like this, and the part's going to fall off over here. Okay. Oops. So this jig is what I use to make rails for this new chair. you know what I said? We have those. And yeah, I had 2 blanks out here. I wasn't planning to use them, so I probably set them aside somewhere. Give me, here, there, right here, right here. So let's see. This is 0. This is the round ones. So I've got pre-drilled holes, and that's what I use. This jig that this template that I just took off of here from up here, I use that to guide to create those 2 holes, and that gets me this angle, and then the other angle is created by sawing this to an angle. So basically what this is, it's a rail that goes inside the seat of this new chair that I've designed. It's tilted out 8.5 degrees and splays out 10 degrees. So the 10-degree splay is created by these screws engaging in these holes, which are set to a jig. So, and then the 8.5 is again this angle that I've cut here. So when this rests against here, it's it's going to be like that at 8.5 degrees against that. So this might be a more elaborate jig than you're going to want, but you asked. I was actually not going to get into this until the next webinar, but anyway, so I've screwed into this into parts that are going to be waste anyway. I'm going to waste those off. Now I'm going to set this saw as low as I can and clear that fence. So this is a jig that uses both a pivot like the first jig that I showed you where I had an adjustable pin here. This is a fixed pin that stays in there. So because I'm swinging from this there, my first radius is going to be, I don't know what that is, 11 inches or something. And then the second radius, I'm just going to take this, well, I can't, I want to take this off and show you the travel of this thing. I've got guide bolts back here that have to come out to do that. So I'll just take this out. These bolts are what guide the movement of the fence from position 1 to position 2. And I've got other stops on here as well so I can change it from making a rocking chair to an armchair to a side chair, because they're all different. So I'll in another webinar I'll get into how to make these based on a part design. In other words, you've got all these different things that you're doing here, but you've got to figure out how to make this do that and generate the part that you want. That part I'm not going to have time to get into, but I'll explain the movement here. Basically, this sled is going to swing from this, and this curve is just clearance. It does not have to be accurate. It just has to support everything as well as it can and miss the blade. But when it gets to this position, it's now going to leave this pin. This pin now here is going to clear. See, it's cleared out here. There's nothing in its way, while this mating fence and sled relationship guides it to a different radius going the other way. And then it's at a certain point, it's going to hit this fence. And this, from this point out, this is a straight, and this point creates a line that's parallel to this, so that the rest of the cut is just going to go straight out like that and end in a straight cut. So I've got a small radius, ends, begins the next radius, and then a straight section. Now, let me just grab one of these parts that it makes. This is actually just, this is a poplar sample, but if you can look at the part, it doesn't look like something you're really going to want to make. Because here, it's not square to the part, but it changes as you go along. Can you see that? Yeah, that angle there. Here, it's, no, not square, but it gets worse out here, and then a little bit more square out here, but that angle is not consistent in that orientation, and it has to be sawn. Let's see if you can pick up the sawing direction is here, so that it's held like this as it goes through the saw. And then the top and the bottom have to be extremely consistent so that a right and left are symmetrically identical to each other. I might have lost some of you all in that description. It's a little complex, but we can get into it more in an upcoming seminar where we start talking about designing jigs for curve. This is just more of an introduction to how curve cutting can work and how you can get control of it, how to design jigs, and what makes sense to design for jigs is a different it's different things to think about. So anyway, we're set to go here. Fire in the hole. So I'm going to cut. See if you can get more elevated, Melanie, so you can get higher up? Yeah, that's pretty good. Mo higher, mo better. So that moves this out more than the front, and I'm sliding the whole thing forward. Now, this is a slightly different rail than the one I showed you a minute ago. This is the inside rail, and it's a little smaller, but the curve is the same. So this is, and let me just set these apart here, and you can see there's the offset, and now I'm going to put them together, and you can see that they're offset here because of that 10-degree angle. So, I have to slide these so that the 10 degrees is represented, but you can see that is an absolutely perfect duplication of that, no matter how you look at it. Oh, I've not got it set. I've just moved it. But anyway, that's as duplicated as you can duplicate. So, any questions?
I think that we can probably move along and have one that we're doing again.
Okay.
life of your jigs? Like how long? I mean, you had one that was 7 years old, but in production, how long do your jigs usually last?
How long do my jigs last? That depends on the intent with which I make them. A lot of times, what I'm doing with a jig is the first time I make it, I'm experimenting with the process to see how that process works. I'm not going to invest a lot in that jig because I need to learn its peculiarities. And also, a lot of times, I'm making a jig for the first time in building a prototype piece. So I don't want to invest a lot in a prototype. Once the prototype is done and we're in production of something, then I'll invest in more robust fixtures and jigs. But simple jigs like this will last 7 or 8 years. A lot of times I'll replace a jig, not so much because the jig is worn out, but in using a piece, I'll come up with a better idea of how to make it. We'll find a flaw in something about the concept, or I just simply come up with a better idea. So it doesn't take a lot to make a jig pretty durable. And this one, it's just MDF with square drive screws holding it together. I will usually glue it. Actually, this one is glued. And that certainly makes them more durable. This is a very durable clamp, and I will, if I decide that this product is no longer going to be in production, I'll save these. In fact, I save all the screws too. So we get pretty darn good durability from just MDF jigs.
There we go.
All right, sorry about that little hiccup, folks. We just lost sound momentarily. So hopefully you're able to hear me, and let us know if you're not, for whatever reason, hearing what I'm saying. So what I just did is I just drew a line. Is that line visible at all? I'm gonna have to do that with a Sharpie.
Everybody can hear.
Let's see if I can do this without getting any on the part itself.
Can you see the line? Yeah.
So, Melanie, the higher you get on this, the better. Will that pause stretch out? There you go. So there's a couple of things that I do when freehand sawing. One is I'm imagining a point. The point from which this curve radiates is always going to be on that line I was talking about before. The point that I'm radiating from here is on the line over here. Actually, it's on the other side of that saw frame, because this is a 40-inch radius. So I'm thinking I'm going to follow around this direction in the arc. And so another thing that I do that helps me maintain a smooth curve is I keep very light pressure on the side of the blade. And I'll come out of the cut like that, and more often than not, the piece is only going to be this wide, and I would completely come out of the part there. So I'm just going to do that. Because I can't make that turnaround here. That half-inch blade just won't make that turn. Plus, that's a kind of a sharp peak I want there, so no blade's really going to make a point. So I'm going to have to exit and then come back in. And I want to think again that radius is 40 inches over that way. So I want to kind of aim this at that and think, and also look at the blade and make sure that this line is entering the blade in a direction parallel to the blade itself. So my hands are making a subtle arc. And that's not terrible. You can still see the line, half the line in most of the curve. I got a little deep there. But it wouldn't take a lot of sanding to get rid of that. But let me. Well, I can't do that with an actual part. I don't have one. But in production, these will add up. There will be more of them. They'll be worse. And if we've got 3 or 4 different people doing this over time, we're not going to have consistency at all. The other thing is, when you're using that jig, it takes about the same amount of time to cut this part out as it did for me to draw it on there with a Sharpie pen. So it's going to take at least twice as long to cut this out by hand or cut it out freehand as it does to use the jig. And there'll be a lot less sanding and certainly no correction of the cut. There'll just be a little bit of sanding to get rid of the bandsaw scratches. So, regardless of what the curve is, the technique is the same. You're just going to imagine where the center point is on the circle, and keep your hands moving around that center point, wherever it is. And keep in mind that you want to be going straight into the blade. And it helps if you can look at two things at one time. One thing you're looking at is the line coming into the blade. The other thing you want to keep an eye on, you're not necessarily needing to look at it constantly, but keep an eye on whether or not this edge, as it passes the blade, is parallel to the blade itself. If it's not, you have to correct that a little bit, going one way or the other, or you're going to either pull the blade into the part or away from the part, or at the very least, you'll have a rougher cut than you need to be getting with this curve cutting business. Are there any questions?
Yes, James asks, what are you looking at or aiming at when you start the cut?
The same, what am I looking at or aiming at when I start the cut? When I'm starting a cut, let's just put this back together. When I'm starting that cut, there's a couple of things I'm looking at that's a little bit different. One is that when you're entering a cut, especially at a low angle, the blade doesn't often want to just enter in a smooth line. It will step a little bit. So what I want to do is I want to enter, and if I'm pushing.
Brian, is that on? I don't know if they can hear you.
You can't hear when the saw's on. If I'm pushing against the blade side a little bit like that, I can easily, Melanie, you'll need to come in as high as you can and as close as you can to see what I'm doing here, because it's fairly subtle. When you're starting, let me reach around and turn I need to turn the saw on. When you're starting a cut at a low angle, a light pressure against the side will steady the blade as it enters. Otherwise, when you start in, it's hard to get a real smooth entry, and the exit is the same way. As you exit a cut, if you're rubbing on the side a little bit, you can exit just as smooth as you want. You can even come back in later, like I can see as the line gets a little heavier here and thinner, I can come back and use the side of that blade like a rasp. See that there? If I'm rubbing the blade on the side, you see where that. And I can take as light and just brush that as lightly as I want to, as long as I am supporting the blade on the side with the wood itself. I should be able to take that out smoothly. So again, basically what I'm thinking about in entering this is an easy start, and I like to have this hand planted on the saw so that I can start, instead of just pushing up here, which is a little harder to control, I'm down here getting into the cut like that, and then I'm rubbing the saw table with my right hand the whole time to help smooth out the cut, or I'll come back here and keep that pressure on the side as steady as I can. And with that side pressure, let's say I get crazy and make a really bad cut. That side pressure, I can come back and go in and out of cut without a jump. The blade is not going to jump sideways if it's got constant pressure, light pressure. I'm not pushing hard enough to move the blade. I'm just maintaining contact on the side while I'm cutting. It gives me a smoother cut. And you can see this black. That's the tail of the blade rubbing from my contact along the side. Are there any other questions?
Um,
I can't hear you, Laura.
Sam asks, how do you handle complex freehand cuts that don't have a fixed radius? We're going to do that in a future webinar.
This is a single radius. This webinar is for single radius. The question is about more complex simulcurves and other things. How do I follow that when there's not just a single radius? And sometimes the radius changes. That opens up a whole nother set of techniques. Freehand, it's the same basically. You have to just keep in mind that if you've got a curve that changes radius as you go along, you've got to just change the way your hands are moving around and imagine a larger radius so they're not moving as much. They're not moving around as much. They're more moving straight. A lot of it is just getting the feel of it. And one of the things that woodworkers don't tend to like to do, and musicians are much better at it, is practice. And so if you just cut curves when you're making a project that has curves in it, and that's the only time you're cutting curves, you're just not going to get very good at it. It doesn't matter what your technique is. You're going to have to spend some time practicing and just take some MDF scraps and draw the same pattern over and over. So you would draw this, if I was practicing this cut, I'm just going to draw this, and these lines will be as close as I can get them, maybe just 1/8 of an inch apart, so that I'm getting a lot of practice cuts on this piece. And, practice often, not, if you're not making projects with a lot of curves in them very often, but you want to get better at the bandsaw, you're just going to have to spend some time practicing and getting the feel of it. There's no, other than with the jigs that I'm talking about here, there's no replacement for practice. And you can make a fun game out of it. Just try to get that line, just split that line the whole way. But it will certainly, what I think will happen if you practice curve cutting just for the sake of getting better at curve cutting, you'll start thinking in curves. It's kind of like learning a foreign language too. You don't really get good at a foreign language until you're thinking in that language. And if you get used to curves enough, you start thinking and designing with curves, and then you become more fluent at it. And then you don't need people like me to tell you how to do it. So anyway, that's what I've got to say about practice. I think there is no substitute for practice for a lot of the techniques I teach.
Do we have any questions from the audience here?
Okay.
Okay. So there was one last question, which I think is kind of outside of the range of what we're doing here, which is, do you have to curve the shoulders of your double tenon? Repeat the question.
Do I have to curve the shoulders of my double tenon?
Maybe because you saw the mortises in the Suniva leg.
I'm going to go grab a part real quick that goes into that joint, and maybe you can help me understand what you mean.
Shop pan. Where did he go?
Back in there somewhere.
So what I did is I just went over.
Brian, you're too far.
What I just did is I ran over to Gabe's station and grabbed a random part. It wasn't made to fit this specific leg, but I'm confident enough in our systems and in his work to show you this. It's going to fit. I'm thinking that maybe you mean, do we have to round over the tenons of the of the joint? And we make rounded tenons. I have a tenon cutting machine that I designed and built that cuts these very precisely, and they're cut to
the shadow.
They're cut to a 10/1000ths taper. Each side of the tenon tapers 5/1000ths of an inch. The mortise has a matching exactly 5/1000ths of an inch taper, and that's just done with custom bits. It's not a separate process or a separate technique that we use. But these are cut with a router bit going around them like this, so that we're following a template. it works. It does what the what is it called? The multi-router, the JDS multi-router does. If you all have seen those, what's it? Is it the FMT jig that Lee makes that does the same thing? The parts mounted in the jig like that, and the router cuts your tenons like that. Either of those systems can cut mortises or tenons and mortises like this. But in this, as well as in all of the joints that we've got where the part is entering a curved segment, we house the whole joint so that we don't have to have a shoulder that's curved to fit the curve that we've cut here. The shoulder is only in between the tenons, and the piece is cut so that the whole part goes in that hole, and it slides in there real easily with glue on it, but there's no lubrication on it right now, so I'm not going to force it in there. But with curves and particular curves and surfaces where you're putting a joint into that not only changes the way you need to be precisely making the curved cuts, but how you address that part later, how you set up to cut a mortise into a curved plane after this part's already shaped. I wrote an article not long ago, maybe it was that would have been 5 years ago. Wrote an article for Fine Woodworking magazine on how to cut joints like this. So you'll find more in that.
That's it.
That a wrap?
Okay.
Well, great to have you guys on board for, but for more on this, there's an article I wrote, just came out a couple months ago in Fine Woodworking. In fact, I made the cover of Fine Woodworking. But it's on doing curves on the bandsaw. It's part of a series, a 4-part series I've been working on how to make curves in general, from freehand bandsawing curves to steam bending curves, laminating curves. This was the second one. The first one is how to decide which way to go. The second one's on bandsawing the curves. The next one is going to be on lamination, and then the final one on steam bending curves. So
You also say next week you're doing curves at
oh, that's
12.
right. For those of y'all who have a chance to get up to Fine Woodworking's live event, their annual conference in Connecticut, I'll be doing bandsaw demonstrations there. So I hope you'll join me. It's at the end of this month, the last weekend of April,
Next weekend.
which is next weekend. I thought it was 2 weeks. It's next weekend.
Next weekend.
Okay.
And then the next webinar is on the 18th.
18th of May. Next webinar is on the 18th of May.
Okay, on May 18th, we're going to do another webinar, and it'll be more into compound curves, kind of like what I demonstrated a little bit ahead of the game earlier, but how you take a part design idea and design fixtures and systems for making that part accurately.
Actually, if folks are interested, we can email you the link to the bandsawing curve article that's in the magazine that Brian just showed. So we can, we'll send that.
All right.
It's in front of the paywall. So
Okay,
Do you
we'll send you a link to that article.
Okay.
okay, we'll be sending out a survey and hope to hear more from you guys so that we can continue to improve our process. And thank you so much for joining us, and happy holiday weekend.
I'll take care.